Assalamu alaikum. I welcome you to the neuroanatomy lecture. We were discussing cranial nerves. Today we will discuss facial nerve. Facial nerve is the seventh cranial nerve. Learning outcomes include the nuclei of the facial nerve, its course, branches, and its distribution. Facial nerve is the seventh cranial nerve. Here you can see the nuclei of the facial nerve. Firstly, we have the nucleus, that is the main motor nucleus of the facial nerve. Here you can see this blue colored close to the midline is the facial motor nucleus. It lies in the reticular formation of the lower part of the pons, the part of the nucleus that supplies the muscles of upper part of the face. It receives corticonuclear fibers from both cerebral hemispheres. The part of the nucleus that supplies the muscles of the lower part of the face receives only corticonuclear fibers from the opposite cerebral hemisphere. And the second is the parasympathetic nuclei. These lie posterolateral to the main motor nucleus, and they are superior salivatory and lacrimatory nucleus. Here you can see they are present posterolaterally. The superior salivatory nucleus receives efferent fibers from the hypothalamus um, through descending autonomic fibers. The information concerning taste also are received from the nucleus of solitary tract from the oral cavity. The lacrimatory nucleus, that is present very close to the main motor nucleus. It receives efferent fibers from the hypothalamus for emotional response and from sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve for reflex lacrimation, secondary to irritation of cornea or conjunctiva. Next, we have the sensory nucleus, that is the that is known as the nucleus of solitary tract. Here you can see this is the nucleus tractus solitarius. This is also known as nucleus tractus solitarius. It lies close to the motor nucleus. Sensation of taste travel through the peripheral axons of the nerve um that are situated in the geniculate ganglion. The central processes of these cells synapse on the nerve cells of the nucleus. Efferent fiber cross the midline and ascend to the ventral postomedial nucleus of opposite thalamus and also a number of hypothalamic nuclei. Here you can see this is the facial nerve. It leaves the brain stem um, with vestibulocochlear nerve. This is basically a mixed nerve, and it is a nerve of the second brachial arch as well. It is mixed with large motor and small sensory root. Here you can see it has two roots, large motor and small sensory root. The functional components include motor and sensory, and the motor includes special visceral and general somatic, while sensory components include special visceral and general somatic. The branches of the facial nerve are given at different levels. Firstly, they are given in the facial canal, then at the level of the stylomastoid foramen, then on the face. Here you can see 12th cranial nerve. This is known as the 7th cranial nerve, second brachial arch nerve. It supplies the muscles that develop from mesoderm of this arch. This is mixed nerve. Here are the components of this nerve. Then we come to its course. The intracranial course include intrapontine pathway, then attachment to the brainstem, then course through the posterior cranial fossa. Then it travels in the petrous temporal bone by its meatal part and part in the facial canal, where it has labyrinthine segments, tympanic segment and mastoid segment, and finally it exits from the cranium and it has extracranial course. Firstly, we come to the intracranial course and its intrapontine part. The fiber from the motor nucleus course through the pons, take a sharp bend around the abducent nucleus. Here you can see the sharp bend that has been taken over the abducens nucleus, producing internal genu of the facial nerve, and they leave the pons between the nucleus of spinal tract of trigeminal and the other facial nucleus. Here you can see how this motor route passes. Here you can see they are entering into the internal acoustic meatus. This is the internal acoustic meatus, and the nerve is entering through this foramen. Um, it is in the internal acoustic meatus where the motor root is lodged in the groove on the anteroinferior surface of the vestibulocochlear nerve, but the sensory root separates them. At the bottom of the internal acoustic meatus, the two roots unite to form a trunk of the facial nerve, and then it enters into the facial canal. Here you can see this whole portion is the portion of the facial canal. In the next figure, this will be more clear. You can see here, this is the facial nerve that arises from the pontomedullary junction. It enters into the internal acoustic meatus, and and you can see this is the facial nerve within the facial canal. Here you can see in the facial canal. This segment of the facial nerve that is present in the facial canal is divided into three segments. One is a labyrinthine segment. It passes laterally above the vestibule of the inner ear to reach the anterior end of the medial wall of the middle ear. Here it bends backwards at a sharp turn called the external genu of the facial nerve, which has the geniculate ganglion on it. Here you can see the yellow one is the geniculate ganglion. Then it has the tympanic segment here it passes backwards in the medial wall of the middle ear till it reaches the posterior end of this wall. This is known as its horizontal part. You can see after the genu there is the horizontal part. Then is the mastoid segment or the vertical segment. It begins at the posterior end of the medial wall. This is the vertical part. Posterior end of the medial wall and passes downwards in relation to the posterior wall of the middle ear to reach the stylomastoid foramen. Here you can see written on the lower part of this figure, there is the stylomastoid foramen. It ends at the stylomastoid foramen. After coming out of the stylomastoid foramen, the nerve crosses the lateral side of the base of the styloid process. It enters the postomedial surface of the parotid gland. Within the gland, it runs forwards for a short distance superficially to the retromandibular vein and external carotid artery and divides into temporofacial and cervicofacial branches. Here we come to the branches and the distribution of the nerve. Branches include within the facial canal, it gives greater petrosal nerve, nerve to stapedius muscle, and cauda tympani nerve. The greater petrosal nerve carries gustatory and parasympathetic fibers, arises from the geniculate ganglion of the facial nerve and enters the middle cranial fossa through hiatus for greater petrosal nerve on the anterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. It proceeds towards the foramen lacerum, where it joins the deep petrosal nerve, which carries sympathetic fibers to form nerve of pterygoid canal. The nerve of pterygoid canal passes through the pterygoid canal to reach the pterygopalatine fossa, where pterygopalatine ganglion is present, which is the parasympathetic ganglion. Here the fibers relay and postganglionic fibers arising in the ganglion, they finally supply the lacrimal gland and mucosal glands of the nose, palate and pharynx. The second nerve is the nerve to stapedius. It arises opposite the pyramid of middle ear and supplies the stapedius muscle. This muscle is meant for damping the excessive vibrations of the stapes caused by high-pitched sounds. Next is the cauda tympani nerve, which is given in the facial canal. It arises in the vertical part of the facial canal, about 6 mm above the stylomastoid foramen. It runs upwards and forwards in the bony canal. It enters the middle ear and runs forward in close relation to the tympanic membrane. Now I will show you some pictures of these nerves. Here you can see the facial nerve. Its course from the internal acoustic meatus up to the level of the stylomastoid foramen. Here you can see this is the greater petrosal nerve. Then nerve to stapedius. Then cauda tympani nerve. It arises from the vertical part of the facial canal above 6 mm above the stylomastoid foramen. It runs upwards, forwards in the bony canal. It enters the middle ear and runs forward in close relationship to the tympanic membrane. This after giving these branches, the nerve then exits from the stylomastoid foramen. Um, After exiting from the stylomastoid foramen, it ascends between the mastoid process and external acoustic meatus and supplies the posterior auricularis, the occipitalis, and intrinsic muscles of back of the auricle. It also gives a digastric branch. It arises close to the posterior auricular nerve. It is short nerve and supplies the posterior belly of digastric muscle. Then it also gives another branch, that is the branch to the stylohyoid, which supplies the stylohyoid muscle. After giving these branches, it turns anteriorly and medially to enter into the parotid gland, where it divides into main two branches, that are the temporofacial and the cervicofacial. The temporofacial gives, here they are more clear. The temporofacial gives two branches, that are the temporal branch that innervates the temporal region, and the zygomatic branches that arise from temporofacial nerve. And then the cervicofacial give three branches, that are the buccal branch that innervates the orbicularis oris, buccinator, and the zygomaticus muscles. Then there is marginal mandibular nerve that innervates the mentalis muscle, and it also gives the last branch, that is a cervical branch, that innervates the platysma. There are three ganglia that are associated with the facial nerve, but one is the geniculate ganglion. It is present on the first bend of the facial nerve. It is sensory ganglion, and it carries taste fibers um, from the tongue, entire two-thirds of the tongue. Here you can see the geniculate ganglion. This is the geniculate ganglion here, and its fibers are traveling towards the tongue. The second is the submandibular ganglion, that is associated with the nerve, is parasympathetic ganglion for relay of secretomotor fibers to the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. The third ganglion that is associated with the facial nerve is the pterygomandibular, that is the pterygopalatine ganglion. Here you can see the location of the pterygopalatine ganglion. It is the largest parasympathetic ganglion and serves as relay station for secretomotor fibers to the lacrimal gland, mucous glands of nose, paranasal air sinuses, palate, and the pharynx. By this, we come to the end of the first lecture of the facial nerve. Thank, thank you for your attention. Allah Hafiz.